Hello, dear listener. This evening I will take it slow as I guide you through the mists of time to the stillest, most horrifying winters of medieval Europe. It was a time when snow fell silently outside, and smoke from chimneys rose into the sky. But in this case, the silence is not about peace. It's the silence of the Black Plague shadowing the door. A winter so filled with death you could cut it with a knife, yet people were still holding on to life. The village square is rattled by the wind, the snow spattering on the stone houses' walls. A year has gone by. Who will protect us, God? The red light of the fire glows upon her cheek. Fear and hope sit in her eyes. For she saw how the neighboring village was silenced last year. But she still breaks bread and shares it with her grandchild, because some hope, no matter how little, can be shared. The plague throttled not just the body, but also the internal voice of man. City streets were bare. Church bells tolled dozens of times a day to mark the departure of another soul. They were afraid to touch one another. Even a handshake or an embrace could kill you, they said. And yet there were those still thinking of others to pray for them, who leave a loaf of bread for the neighbor in his illness. For even in that day, the last vestige of man's humanity was compassion. The winters of those years were biting not because of their cold, but because of their silence. The houses were boarded up, and people prayed in whispers inside. The children were silent, they had vanished. Only figures draped in black moved slowly up and down the city's tiny streets, plague doctors in their long-beaked masks. Their hands were shaking, but their steps were unhurried, because every house was a possibility, death or miracle. And a candle always burned in the midst of all that darkness. A little window, a flickering light. That light just meant a family was still living and fighting. A light that was the spark of the human spirit shining towards us from across the ages. Because a world in which death prowled about was, after all, a world where if someone's hearth was still lit, there was still hope. In those bleak winters, people pay off crumbs of existence. A bowl of warm soup, a prayer, a song. Maybe that was what it meant to be human, to keep on living, no matter what. The Black Death silenced cities, but it could not blow out that little light in the human soul. And now, dear listener, I shall tell you the tale of that light. A monk, a mother, a child, and a stranger's paths will intersect on the frozen lands of Europe. Each one will hold on to that whisper. Winter may be long, but spring always returns. The aged walls of the monastery just outside the village creaked beneath the snow. The ice flowers on the windows shone, frozen flower, overlapping with the soft glow indoor. Monk Matthew shuddered in his tattered habit, shielding the lamp in his palm. Each pace reverberated, dying out in the stone halls like a mute prayer. His brothers had gone a long time ago. Some died of the plague, others went down to the villages and helped the sick and never come back. Now he was the last at the monastery, a soul in the hand of God in silence. Matthew had only one friend, the monastery's teeny library. In among the dusty manuscripts on the shelves, he keeps open an old hymnal that rests in a corner night after night. He whispered his prayer as if afraid of waking God. Domini miserere nobis, Lord, have mercy on us. Outside the wind was blustering, rattling the monastery's wooden doors. But he thought prayers this sort of warmth. One night, there was a soft knock at the door of the monastery. Matthew thought at first that it was the wind. But when the noise came again, he grabbed the lamp and went to the door. When he cracked it open, he glimpsed a young woman with a child in her arms. Her face was pale, lips were blue. The woman said, almost in a whisper, "Please take him inside. I can't go any further." Matthew glanced at the woman's eyes, and he saw a shadow of death. He took the baby from his arms and made the sign of the cross on the woman's forehead. The woman gratefully smiled and vanished in the darkness. She was never seen again. The monk swaddled the infant in a warm blanket in a cramped room. The child had a blazing fever. Days passed. The fever would abate, then flare up again. Matthew prays every day and makes herbal mixtures. He didn't know the child's name, but he began to call him Lumen, a Latin word meaning light, because in the midst of darkness, that child was like a fragment of hope that God had not forgotten. It was bad news from the village. Most of the houses were deserted, the crops left to waste. But Matthew still lit a small fire in the monastery cloister. Maybe no one noticed it, but that fire said, "Life is still here." At times, when the child's breath diminished, he gave him to pray on his knees. "Even if this winter never ends, show him a spring." On a day, in the morning when the snow was no longer falling softly, a second shadow was seen at the monastery gate. This time it was a male with a bag. Coal black was the cloak he wore. Tired was his countenance. "I've brought help," he said. "There are still a handful of us who survived from that village." Matthew let him in, amazed. They sat by the fire and warmed up. Without saying a word, the man took out some bread and gave some to Lumen, who ate silently. "Maybe it is giving him strength," he said. Then the monk knew. It wasn't the cold that was catching. It was hope. Winter was coming to an end, but he was no longer alone. The fire popped and cracked against the stone walls of the monastery. Out the storm had passed. Breaking and stirring their curiosity, were still wrapped into one soul as ever. They spoke in Matthew and an unknown man. When they shoveled the snow from in front of the door, he and Matthew made soup from the little barley and dried grass they could find in the old pantry of the monastery. Lumen was healing a bit at a time, day by day. She was still frail, and her tiny body weak, but the light in her eyes had already started to glow once more. The introduction was the briefest speech he gave. He said his name was Elias. He was the blacksmith of the village. "My fire had even gone out," he said one night. "But this child, something about him, it just started burning again." In that instant, Matthew thought that sometimes God's miracles are two people coming into contact with each other. At night, in the monastery chapel, they prayed. Elias didn't know how to pray very well, but he knelt silently beside Matthew and stared at the candle light together. "Maybe this also is prayer," he said with a smile, as warm as the first spring morning in the heart of that stone-cold winter. Distilled one morning, there was a faint noise outside. The first they thought it was the wind, the second then both were silent and listening. It was the church bell. The bell that had been silent for weeks, maybe months, is now ringing again. Matthew closed his eyes for a moment. "So someone is still alive," he whispered. Elias shook his head. "Or they bury somebody." Both alternatives were different sides of the same lethe to them. Life was still running. Later that day, Elias sought to make his way outside. "I want to see the village. Maybe there's still someone breathing there." Matthew hesitated but finally nodded. "Go," he said, "but return before dark. The cold is unforgiving." Elias smiled. "I'm the blacksmith's son. I'm used to the cold." After his departure, the silence fell once more upon the monastery. Matthew cradled Lumen and gazed out the window. The snow covering everything is absorbed far off. A raven flew under the gray sky. At that very moment, the monk heard a voice within his heart. "To keep another alive, for that alone is to breathe." He was Elias, and when he came back in the night, his eyes glowed in the dark. He had a small bag in his hand. "I picked up some wheat," he said. "In somebody's home, long ditched. It even had some raisins in it, or dried fruit of some kind." Matthew's eyes filled with tears. "These are like a feast," he said, smiling. On that night, they three ate the meager wheat. At the conclusion of the meal, Matthew said under his breath, "Maybe God hasn't forsaken us." On Elias's part, however, he bowed his head. Maybe God put us here so we could find each other again. With that line, at the deepest, darkest point in the middle of winter, another miracle was born. Humanity was remembered once more. When day broke, the sky had turned to glaucous. The snow was already descending on us in a slow drizzle, and the quiet was nearly calming. Matthew, Elias, and Lumen sat in the monastery garden and ate the remainder of the soup. They were so captured by the steam rising from the soup in the cold air that they lost track of time. At that instant, nothing in the world seemed to exist beyond their breaths. Elias gazed into the distance. "Things used to fly off my anvil at this time of day," he said. "The peasants would come to be shod to harrow. Now only the wind seeks me." Matthew gave a small, wordless nod. "But you retain sparks. You have that fire in your hands. The forge's location has shifted." They kept quiet for a long time. Lumen traced a tiny sun in the snow with his finger. Matthew smiled. "Maybe in that drawing is hidden the spring," he said. Elias said, "Well then, when the snow comes off, we'll get the sun." As the day advanced and the black clouds scattered, a mild smoke floated up from the forest surrounding the monastery. Elias nervously stood up. "This could be a sign," he said. Matthew narrowed his eyes. "Either they are survivors from another village, or a fire." They went out together. Snow was crunching beneath their feet. The air was still. At the forest edge, they spotted a few human forms. The smoke was coming from a tiny fire. 2 elderly men, a few children, and 3 women were sitting around the fire. They were attempting to shield the fire with their icy hands. When one of the women saw them, she flinched in terror. "Don't come any closer," she screamed. "We don't have the disease." Matthew gestured. "We don't either," he whispered. "We're just alive." The woman stopped for a breath, then cried her tears. "Then, come on," she said. The men sat #roused from their sleep near the fire, and 2 or 3 words crossed their lips as they began to speak with one another. There was an empty silence. No one knew what to say. But everyone felt the same thing, the shame and gratitude of survival. Elias threw the boy sitting next to him a crumb of bread. The boy stared at him in astonishment, then looked up shyly. Matthew knelt before the fire. "That's a small community," he said. "Maybe God has given us a fresh start." One of the women nodded. "Until the spring, we can hold on together." That night, for the first time, laughter was heard within the mute walls of the monastery. A faint, momentary but real laugh. And perhaps at that minute the whole winter broke. The following day, the atmosphere was serene and almost tranquil. The sky had brightened to a pale blue, and the snow was slowly starting to sparkle. When Matthew walked into the monastery courtyard, he took a breath. The chill was still sharp, but there was a certain serenity in it. They were not alone any longer, and human voices rang out again beneath these stone walls. Among the women was named Beatrice. Her husband had perished from the plague, and she had taken to hiding in the woods for days with her 2 children. "Loneliness is worse than death," said she. "But now, here, even with just a handful of people, I can breathe." Matthew gave her a bowl of hot water. "These walls used to reverberate with prayer," he said. "Perhaps now those prayers echo in your voices." Elias and 2 young men made his way over the fields near the monastery. They tested the ground beneath the snow. The frost was still deep, but Elias smiled when he pressed his fingers into the soil. "This soil still contains warmth," he remarked. "We can still live, that's what it means." One of the young men asked in fear, "But what if the plague comes back?" Elias touched his shoulder. "Fear kills faster than hunger, son. If we sow seeds, God will give us light," Elias says somehow. It was everyone's job that day. Beatrice made quilts for the children to stay warm. and one of the elders patched up the monastery's dilapidated oven. Matthew dusted off the small altar of the monastery and lit a candle in front of the cross, which was covered with dust. "This will be a house again," he murmured. When night fell, the wind blew again outside. They were all sitting around a fire in the tiny room. Lumen sat on her knees and told a tale. "Once upon a time, there was a village buried beneath the snow," she recited. "No one ever smiled in that place. Then someone lit a candle. The candlelight poured out the window, and even the snowflakes sang." One of the females blinked out a tear. "Your story sounds like ours," she said. Matthew smiled. "Maybe every fable is a voice in someone's survival." As the darkness deepened, even their pulses were synchronized to the sound of fire crackling. It was known to all that with the coming of morning, it would be cold once more, and the snow would surely fall once more. But they were no longer alone. And if loneliness was destroyed, darkness would be unable to last for long. That night, Matthew prayed and looked out the window. A star hovered in the air, hidden beneath the snowflakes. "You haven't forgotten us," he whispered. That star, perhaps, was the answer they'd been seeking all winter long. Hope was sometimes nothing more than a light, if you just had the guts to look away from the dark. The following morning, warm sunbeams coming through the windows of the monastery covered the snow with silver. The air was crisp, breath visible, yet the sky was different. Not dark blue, but a color of patience. Matthew stepped outside in the courtyard as soon as he woke up. A voice of a bird told from under the snow, very light but known vocalization. A sparrow shivering on icy boughs. As the monk peered down at that minuscule being, he muttered to himself, "Life turns on quietly." It was a day's work for all and sundry. Elias attempted to warm some pieces of iron with the remaining coals in the furnace. He wanted to fashion a tiny plowshare. "We must arouse the earth," he remarked. "Beatrice has made capes for the children out of old feed sacks." Matthew went to the monastery library and sorted the ancient manuscripts. On a page that was peeping out from under the dust read, "When a person is alone, they can hear God's voice more clearly." That statement kept ringing in Matthew's mind that morning. At noon, Elias and one of the young men came back from outside. They had dry branches in their hands and blueberries bags on their backs. "We came across an old cabin at the edge of the forest," said Elias. "There are a couple of tools in there. Could come in handy." Matthew nodded. "Everything we now get is our own, because all that is shared by those who survive is sacred. Whatever we find is now ours, because everything shared by those who survive is sacred." Lumen sat next to Beatrice in the afternoon and sketched something. There was a stain of charcoal on her fingers, a piece of old parchment in front of her. "What are you drawing?" the woman asked. Lumen said with a smile, "Spring, but I don't know what its shape is. I'm just envisioning it." Beatrice's throat constricted. "It's all right," she said. "Spring is imaginary born first." By the evening, the storm rolled back in. The wind hammered on the monastery doors, and snowflakes danced like praying murmurs. All were listening around the fire that Elias spoke. "In the old days, at the end of every winter there was a ceremony in the village square," he said. "Little children rang bells, and women created flower crowns. We were waiting for that day. We called it the end of the black winter." Lumen asked excitedly, "Can we do it this year too?" Elias smiled. "We can. Maybe that's exactly why we're still here." Matthew turned to look at this little band, whose faces flickered in the glow of firelight. They each had the same thing, fatigue, defeat, but an unrelenting hope. "Yes," he said softly, "but we won't wait for the winter to end. We shall greet it." And that night, as a blizzard howled about the monastery walls, inside was lit the first gleam of a new season. The next day the cold had thawed somewhat. The snow lay still heavy in patches, but the winds had died down, and the sky had a faint, hopeful look. In the monastery cloister, Elias rested the small plowshare on the stone pavement, and he began to straighten the iron. The sound of the hammer resonated in the quiet. Each strike was a heartbeat that said, "We are still here." Matthew observed them from the door of the monastery. Elias's face was covered in grime, but his eyes gleamed with resolve. Lumen drifted about with a tiny block of wood in his palm, incising forms into the snow. "That is the way of spring," he said. Line and curve were the marks of a prayer. At midday, through the overcast, a faint sun shone. The sun was so feebly bright it was more like a dream, but it produced little sparkles on the snow. Beatrice lifted up her face to the heavens, and her eyes were filled with tears. "I just realized how long we've been without the sun." Matthew was at her side. "Sometimes it's dark so long when light shines through we don't even know how to see it." Conclusions of the day was again consensus. They would have a little festa. Even in the dead of winter, they get ceremonies. Elias chose to fix the ancient monastery bell. Matthew collected the broken candles in the chapel, and he melted them down into new ones. Beatrice and the children collected dried branches from the woods, and they attached dried carnation flowers and ribbons of color to the twigs. Before darkness fell, the tempo of the courtyard of the monastery gradually increased with brightness. The fire was lighted, and the candles with their bright light beamed on the walls of stone. The few of them huddled around the fire. Elias raised the bell in his hand. The first sound from the iron was faint and high-pitched, but the echo that came after seemed to blur into the sky. Lumen clapped with her tiny hands. "This is for our winter's ending," Matthew said with a smile. "For spring to come, we bring it out." Everyone quietly agreed. When the sparks from the fire flickered in the night, Beatrice started to hum a slow song. It was a tune once performed at village celebrations. She invented the words she had forgotten, but the soul of the song was identical: hope. And so that, in the darkness, a few people began their spring that night. The bells, now silent, in the villages, but in that monastery a bell was still rung. Maybe even God had heard that sound. As the firelight flickered onto the walls, Matthew was filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. That tiny band was now family. It was never spoken aloud, but in everyone's hearts were the same feelings. We are ancestors. Elias smiled and tossed in another log. You know, even in the middle of winter plowing is a bit crazy. But I love this madness. Matthew nodded. Faith is at times the quietest form of madness, he said. When the world has gone mad, the madmen that hear their hearts are the ones who are left. Lumen sat down by the fire. In her hand was a tiny sliver of iron Elias had given her. "What's this for?" she said. Elias squinted and stared into the distance. "Maybe it's a new plow. Maybe it's just a keepsake. But the most important thing was this. This iron had warmed up again after the cold. So it's living too," said Lumen. "Is this alive too?" "Yes," Elias said with a smile. "Just like us." Beginning of story. As the dawn was breaking, the snow had started up again outdoors, this time falling at a gentle pace, almost as if it were falling kindly. Beatrice recited an old folklore prayer after dinner and before bedtime for the children. Slow, calm, and maternal was her voice. The cold goes, the snow melts, even flowers are born from the stone. Flowers grow from the stones. God linger in people, hearts still beat. Never forget God is not silent, patience is noted. And as the pronunciations of the word rang out across the room, we were all together becoming more and more calm. Matthew closed his eyes as the prayer. He didn't realize how much a line so simple could be. But on that night in his dream, the monastery garden had blossomed in springtime. The snow had receded, and yellow blossoms had erupted from the earth. Lumen was running, Elias was hammering iron. Beatrice sang. Bells rang once and again. The dream was so real that when Matthew awoke, he found himself unable at first to place where he was. When the morning arrived, the air was still chilly, but the sky was a bright blue. The wind had abated. Matthew passed out and took in the fresh air. Even in the bitter cold, there was a cleanness in the air. "It's the smell of spring," he told himself. Elias joined him. "The ground is still frozen, but I heard water," he said. Surprised, Matthew asked. "Where?" "The brook at the edge of the woods," Elias said. "The ice is beginning to break up. That's a good sign." Then Matthew whispered a prayer, "Thank you. Maybe to God, maybe to life, maybe just to patience." The snowflakes were already melting and drifting to the earth that morning as winter was saying goodbye, but no one paid attention to this. And that was the moment when a generation passed. Matthew was up early that morning. The sky an afterimage between gray and blue, and there is a faint light coming up on the horizon. The smell of wet earth was in his nostrils as he opened the door of the monastery. For the first time in months it smells not of snow but of soil. At that point, his knees nearly gave out. "My God," he murmured, "you are still here." Elias was already outside, with an iron plow. In his hands he attempted to reach the ground by digging through the snow. Steam rose from his shoulders, his breath like smoke, hanging in the air. "Today," he smiled, "I will wake the earth." Matthew nodded. "We will not pray today. Today we will work. Because sometimes the best prayer is to get your hands dirty in the land." Beatrice and the children came outside too. They have pushed the snow aside with their tiny hands. Their expression is all a mix of surprise and joy. Lumen squatted down and spotted a green blade of grass under the snow. It was a small, fragile leaf. "It's alive!" she exclaimed. "Look, it's alive!" That tiny leaf was like a response granted to all of humanity. Life makes a way, regardless of what. Elias sank the plow into the earth. The metal bit into the hard ground, but he refused to quit. He pressed again and again. The plow, at last, went through the earth. At that instant, the earth seemed to have its bowels pour out. Matthew had tears in his eyes. "There," he said softly. "Even soil that's since dead will breathe again if you wait long enough." Everyone at there was thinking the same thing that morning. Winter might not be over, but it was no longer unassailable. Beatrice faced the children. "Don't you forget this day. This is the day we are making a fresh start." Lumen smiled. "Today is the day winter's heart was broken." They worked all day. They laid dry grass on the stone walls around the monastery and mended the old rain barrel. Elias forged another small iron bell. "This shall be the bell of spring," he said. "We'll ring it every morning to remind us and the heavens that we're living, that we are alive." Turning pink, the sky following the sun shelling over the horizon. Matthew sat on the wall and said nothing as he looked at the scene. "You know, Elias," he said, "maybe God didn't want us to perform a miracle. He only wanted us not to leave each other." Elias smiled. "That must be the miracle." Everyone was round the fire that very night. The little party was weary but quiet. The sound of the wind was no more frightful, but more like a lullaby. And, for the first time, crying prayers were prayed by no one, because prayer was already wrapped around them in that time. It was early morning when this happened. The sun was shining through the thick stone walls of the monastery for the first time, throwing a warm glow. A thin mist rose from the earth, and the melting snow sent little waterfalls trickling down. Matthew was at the door, with the sleeves of his robe folded over his hands, and looking silently on. Even the smell of the air was different. It no longer smelled of death, but rather of living. Elias came up beside him, his face bright with the sun. "Look," said he, The earth is returning to us all that we have lent her beneath the snow. Recall this plant? Lumen found it. Matthew smiled. Yes, now another one has sprouted. It is growing up beside it. For a second, they said nothing and looked at those two tiny green leaves. In the darkness and brutality of the period, those two leaves were miracles. Life was unfolding again in the monastery courtyard. Countless Beatrice took the children for a walk to the edge of the forest and picked dry branches. When they came back, all of them were flushed and windblown, their cheeks pink. Cold but beautiful, said Beatrice. We are not so scared of winter anymore. Matthew nodded. Fear grows with loneliness. Now that we're together, we've nothing to fear. That day Elias placed the bell he had just cast on the door of the chapel. What came forth with the first strike was a deep, clear sound. It rolled off the walls of the monastery, and then traveled down into the valley. That long breathless land seemed to grow breath again with that bell. Lumen covered his ears, but smiled. It's a nice sound, he said. My heart trembled. Matthew knelt down and rested his hand on the child's shoulder. It's good that your heart is trembling. It means life is existing still, working still. When night fell, all retiring to rest by the fire, Elias told of the old times, village festivals, plough ceremonies, first days of sowing. His words seemed to evoke a forgotten image in the portraits. Fire! That's our people who shake the dust from their feet and gather round the fire, he said. The chill passes, the pestilence passes, the regrettable human act of extinguishing works its result in which we always hope. But the ones that don't snuff out the fire, friend. Beatrice hummed softly a song. Lumen's voice joined hers. It was a little tune, not happy but quiet. As the wind began to stir again outdoors, that airborne song penetrated the stone walls and blended with the sky. Matthew shut his eyes and thought at that instant, might God hearken not to prayers, but to these melodies? Seated with himself in the darkness, and then he was gone to the chapel. Alone? A little while that night, after they were asleep, Matthew alone to the chapel. He remained silently for some time in the flickering light of the candle. Then he whispered softly, Defend us, but especially don't forget our hearts. And that prayer hovered in the air like the last cold peace of winter. The following morning, Matthew had been waiting in the tiny cloister of the monastery, listening to the silence. No bells chimed and no winds grieved. Only water sounds. Melted snow had seeped along stone gutters, and a small sip had formed. That full, round sound came to Matthew's ears like a lullaby. Life is flowing again, he muttered. Elias had gone out early in the morning. He was at the iron forge, hammer in hand. The hammer's sound was no longer the sound of death. Now it was the sound of vitality, like a heartbeat pounding in a cold winter. Lumen would bring him water, smiling each time. The sound of your hammer is like a song, she said. Without looking up, Elias responded, This song is the song of the earth waking up. Beatrice was washing out the inside of the cloister. She had cleansed the soot off the walls, and she had brought the windows open. The land breeze brought a breath of fresh air to the room with it today. She shut her eyes momentarily, inhaling deeply. The scent shifted, she said. Matthew was observing her from the doorway. Yes, he said. It smells like earth now, not death. That day, at about midday, a rat-tat-tat came from distance. At first no one believed it. It seemed like a murmur conjured up by the wind. Then the sound got near and was easier to distinguish. The sound of hooves. Elias ran out with the hammer in his hand. They could see a horse moving at a slow pace across the white snow cover. A tired man was riding it. He wore a tattered cloak, and his face was that of weeks of weariness. When he came to the gate of the monastery, he got down from his horse and bowed. Are you are still alive?" he said in a trembling voice. Matthew ran toward, seized him by the arm, and assisted him to his feet. "We're alive," he said, "and you are no longer alone." The man's name was Thomas. He came from a village nearby. The plague had hit there as well. Only a handful of people survived. "I set out," he said, "to see if there were any living souls. The churches were silent, the villages empty. But I saw this from a distance, so I got closer and could see the features of his face. Smoke was rising. I smelled the fire." Elias smiled. "That fire never went out." Tomas circulated among the few. Beatrice brought him some hot soup and Lumen sat down next to him. "You're one of us now," said the child. At that instant, tears filled Tomas's eyes. "I had forgotten," he said. "I'd even forgotten how long it had been since I'd been held by someone." Matthew sat silently down beside them. "People can forget," he said, "but life tells us. Sitting by the fire sharing a piece of bread. That's how we remember." That night, there was a feeling of everyone's being somewhat closer to each other. The crackling of the fire, the ringing of the bell, their warm breath, it all seems like a kind of prayer now. And Matthew said to himself for the first time in a long time, "Maybe this world can't be saved, but we can save each other." But with the arrival of Tomas, a change came over the monastery. The place, which had previously been nothing but silence and routine, now seemed alive. Tomas, with those tales which he imported, animated the frozen walls of stone. As each night they gathered around the fire, you'd hear him speak in a slow voice. "In our village, we drew a cross on every door," he said one night. "We thought it would console us. But now things have cleared. Only one thing was left, silence. That was such a silence that the wind was ashamed to rustle." Matthew took a sip of warm wine from the cup in his hand. He added, "Silence is like prayer sometimes, but sometimes it's like punishment." Elias looked at Tomas. "I'm glad you came here," he said. "You are not alone now. Stay with us." Tomas nodded, tears running down his face. I had even forgotten how to speak. It was like my tongue had hibernated, and it's beginning to melt." Lumen chuckled. "Then spring must have come with you." The good-natured observation elicited a smile from all. Beatrice ran her fingers through the boy's hair and said, "You're right. Spring is a person sometimes." From that day on, Tomas would work in the monastery. He made baskets from tree limbs, chopped wood, and patched holes in the walls. He had full strength in his hands. "Work fixes you up," he said one day. Elias nodded. "Because work is the nearest thing to hope." When evening fell, they all met in the chapel. A little candle was lighted. Matthew kept silent a long time in place of prayer, then said slowly, "Sometimes we seek God in the sky, but possibly he's under our hands." Beatrice raised her eyes. "Maybe in that little fire we're all using this coal to try to push away." Outside the wind was howling again, but it was no longer a menacing sound. It was now like a breath of nature. Once more he had been snowing to a halt. Tiny white flakes drifted through the windows, nestling to silence on the stones of the monastery. Lumen looked outside and said, "The snow has returned. But now I do not fear." Tomas smiled. "Don't be scared, for now we have a fire, because we're together." Matthew rested his hand on his shoulder. "And just as every winter is born a spring." That night equals, no one was alone. The heat of the fire did not heat up the walls of the room, but the hearts of the people inside. While the snow was tumbling down outside, something else was coming into the world inside. Faith. But this was faith in people rather than in the sky. The sound of the bell of the monastery once again clattered outside the door in the early hour of the day. But that was not the reverberation of death. That was the reverberation of life. When the bell strikes, its sound penetrates the valley with a message to the earth to wake up. Matthew took up position on the doorstep and saluted the sun. His eyes were squinting, and he had a faint, light smirk on his mouth. You just get up in the morning and wake up in a miracle. That day Elias had entered the forest at dawn in the morning. Tomas was with him. We need to get some wood, he said, but I also want to take a little breath. As they moved through the snow, the silence was broken by the buzz of melting water dripping from the boughs. Tomas looked around. Even the forest is breathing now, he said. Like everything went dead for a little bit, and now it's coming back. Elias nodded. Life always comes back, Tomas. And if we forget, it is not forgotten. When the men arrived at the clearing, they came upon a stone cross which had not been wrought in years. The moss-covered inscription was barely readable. Tomas patted the snow aside with his hands and peered. Look, he said. Here it says light is born out of darkness. Elias took a deep breath. We are just the two of us. There were others before us who lived to die. The two are now silent before the cross. Wind whistled through their hair, twigs snapped, a crow, off in the distance, cawed. Then Elias murmured, Maybe we are nothing but the echo of prayers long ago cast. When they came back to the monastery, they found Beatrice and Lumen awaiting them. The little boy came running excitedly. The soil is softened up. I stepped on the edge of the garden and my foot sank. Matthew smiled and bent down. Seed, then we'll let seeds tomorrow. Beatrice rubbed her hands. We have few seeds, but we have plenty of intention. That's enough. When dusk was falling, they were all assembled. Tomas unfolded a piece of cloth over the small table Elias made. Beatrice set a pot of oatmeal on it, and Lumen placed a couple of dry leaves she found outside on the center of the table. It is for the decoration, and she spoke proudly. Matthew looked at them. Sometimes that's wealth, the warmth of hearts gathered around a table, he said. We are rich today. The fire crunched. The bell quivered a little in the wind. And in that moment, all knew, inside these walls of stone, there was now a family not of blood, but of hope. Outside, the snow had begun again, but now no one incalmed the cold, for the heat within was greater than the keenest winter frost. The next day was cooler, and the sky more clear than it had been in days. A pale but optimistic blue had taken the place of the gray clouds. As Matthew entered the monastery recess, sunlight fell across the stone slab, while crystals on the snow shone like myriad tiny stars. He closed his eyes for a moment as the sun streamed down on his face. Such simple happiness, he whispered, and yet so neglected. Beatrice joined him, a basket in her hand. Inside the basket, they included several packs of seeds. These are the first things we'll plant in spring, she said. Matthew glanced inside the basket and reached in, as if the technique of handling the tiny brown seeds were some sacred ritual. You know, Beatrice, he said, a seed is a prayer. Buried in the earth, it is silent, and then one day, the most unanticipated day, it speaks up. Tomas was preoccupied tilling the ground with Lumen. The Lucas and his friends started digging into the now soft ground, and yes, getting their hands all muddy, but not even once did they lose their smiles. Look, exclaimed Lumen. I see a worm. That means the soil is alive. Tomas chuckled. A living worm means a living world, my young friend. Elias had nailed a small wooden plaque to the entries of the monastery. With charcoal, he had scrawled these words across it. Life has begun again here. When Matthew read the sign, he stopped for a second and then breathed deeply. Maybe one day someone who comes this way will read these words, he said, and they will have hope. At nightfall, everyone shook off the fatigue of the day around the fire. Elias took out a used flute from his bag. It was nearly shattered, but the sound it produced was gentle and sweet. The sound of the flute penetrated every corner of the room, all the beams and rafters, and all the hearts of the assembled. Lumen said softly, as she closed her eyes, "I meet the smell of spring when I hear this." Slowly turning a cup in her hand, Beatrice said thoughtfully, "Maybe God brings spring first through music." Matthew smiled. "Then we are God's messengers." Upon hearing this, Matthew smiled. The wind blew again that night, but now it was warm with a little of winter in it. The snow had turned to rain. From the corners of the roofs, water trickled thinly, and each drop was winter's last tear, the closing of an era, the opening of new hope. By morning the ground about the monastery had mostly thawed. The snow had melted to sputtering life under mud shells. The birds were back. The long silent sky was alive with chirping. Matthew stood at the gate of the monastery, listening to those sounds. His eyes filled up with tears. "There's a time when I thought I would never hear that again," he said. Elias, Tomas, and Lumen were struggling to lay an antique plow-like implement. "We'll be plowing the soil for the first time today," Elias said. "Like with every year." Matthew smiled. "It's very good that you say like every year, because that phrase has the taste for hope." In the monastery courtyard, Beatrice was handing out seeds in tiny bags she had made. "Wheat here, lentils here," she said. "A handful of barley over there. It isn't much, but it's sufficient." Tomas scooped the seeds on his palm and gazed at them for a long time. "I still can't fathom how such small things can mean so much," he said. Beatrice nodded. "Every seed is a promise to a life, Tomas. We just believe in it." The dirt was thick but soft. Elias pushed the plow. Tomas pressed down behind them. When the first furrow parted the earth, everyone stopped. Lumen clapped excitedly. "There! The soil breathed. What up from the earth? When one furrows the ground, it breathes." Matthew stooped down, and some loose earth tumbled from the clodlets in his hand. "Wet, cold, but alive. Like our hearts." At that a hush fell on all. Only the faint cries of birds and the noise of the plow turning up the ground were audible. After this brief but holy interval, Elias laid aside the plow. "You do not have to pray anymore," he said. "We have already talked to the soil." Matthew nodded. "You're right. Sometimes prayers are not spoken, they are lived." Everyone was worn down, but quiescent by nightfall. Their hands were caked with mud, their backs slick with sweat, and yet their faces bore expressions of exhilaration. Beatrice placed a small pot over the fire. She added the last of the barley and some dried herbs. "Our banquet is prepared," she said with a smile. Lumen chuckled. "This is a feast?" Beatrice smiled. "You're not hungry today, and so this is a feast." Tomas went outside after the meal. The sky was brightening little by little, but the darkness was not this time so frightening. The first stars had appeared on the horizon. He drew a small wooden cross from his pocket and drove it into the earth. "We began over here," he claimed. A mild breeze wafted through the air, and that string on the cross fluttered softly. Tomas knew it at that moment. Winter was done. The darkness became not an end, but the beginning for a brand new story. The next day was like a rebirth of the air. Rain had ceased, and the sky was phenomenally blue and bright. A golden light fell on the monastery's stone walls as birds hopped from branch to branch. Matthew went out after morning prayers. Beneath his feet the mud no longer was dark but white, the wet earth mirroring the sun. "The world is cleansing itself," he whispered. Elias removed the plow from his land and was erecting a new barn with Tomas. Their palms were cracked with calluses, dirt was entrenched under their fingernails, and yet they didn't cease. Tomas smiled and said, "These hands that once only prayed, now I hammer nails." Matthew for a moment lightly touched his shoulder. Maybe that is precisely the prayer God wants. With the children, Beatrice had gone to the edge of the woods. After the rain had fallen, mushrooms had come up. They gathered them into small baskets. This one also wants to live. Lumen held one up and said. Beatrice lowered herself to her level. Everything wants to live. Beatrice told me. Everything wants to live. Even us. Late in the afternoon, all assembled in the courtyard of the monastery. As the sun went down, the sky graduated from pink to peach and sank into the black hills. At that moment, Elias broke the silence. You know, this is the first time in such a long time that I have watched the sunset in peace. Tomas nodded. Because we know the edge of the darkness now. Beatrice turned up with a little test tube she had taken with her. I gathered rainwater, she said. Perhaps one day we'll rinse the seeds in this water. Matthew raised his drinking vessel. So let's beseech this water, a prayer firming as the earth, a prayer frail as a man. A breeze came up and caused the candles to flicker, but not to be extinguished. A peaceful calm was frozen on everyone's face. Lumen glanced at the flames. Do you think, she asked, that God listens to us? Matthew grinned. If we're hearing each other, then he's hearing us too. When darkness fell, the monastery walls were no longer emptying out sounds of solitude, but sounds of life. The wind no longer sang beyond the windows, but among the hearts deep within. Winter's story was not done, but now it was no longer a lament, but a poem of renewal. Early in the following day, a faint haze overlaid on the grounds of the monastery. In that gloomy pre-dawn hush, only the flapping of birds' wings was audible. Matthew took a breath and was standing mid-courtyard. The smell of the air was no longer that of winter. A mixture of damp stone, wet earth, and fresh grass. It was the smell of life. Elias had been up early, working on the plow. The ring of each hammer blow, as it met the metal, ricocheted around the stone walls of the monastery, and set the pace for the new day. Tomas was nailing a couple of planks together by the barn, saying, We're going to make this back into a storage place. As Matthew observed them, he thought, they didn't just survive. They learned how to live again. Beatrice displayed the seeds in a tiny cloth bag. We should plant them today, she said. They will grow in a couple of weeks. Lumen was excited and leaped. I will help as well, even if I get my hands dirty. Elias smiled. There's holiness in dirt sometimes, little friend, because it is the sign of rebirth. The soil was moist but pliable. The seeds were spilled out of their palms and into the soil. All were buried in silence and prayer. Matthew clasped his hands and muttered, Shake every seed like a heart. Let every rain fall like hope, even when darkness is nigh. Earth, do not forget us. Tomas shut his eyes. Elias bowed his head. Tomas closed his eyes. Beatrice smiled. At that exact moment, all of a sudden everyone experienced the same thing, which was more than just surviving, but regaining their will to live. By evening the clouds were all gone. There were so many stars you could. Lumen looked up to the sky, which was gleaming. I've never seen so many stars, he said. Matthew smiled. Maybe they were always there. We just couldn't see them because of the darkness. Tomas rested his hand on his chest. Even darkness hides no stars, Elias added quietly. We came from that same darkness. Or the winter was meant for that. The wind blew, and the monastery bell swings softly by itself. That noise resounded through the valley. This time it was not the echo of death, but the echo of life. No one prayed that night. There was no need, because now God was in the light of the fire, in the seed, and in the eyes of one another. When the sun's first rays struck the stones of the monastery, tiny green sprouts had broken through the earth. They were thin, almost invisible stalks, but each one was a quiet triumph. Matthew knelt and lightly brushed a shoot with his fingers. There, he told himself. Not even death could get the earth to persuade. Elias rubbed his eyes as he observed the scene at a distance. If a tree can turn green again after all this cold and hunger and terror, he thought, then so can we. Tomas came over, holding a small piece of wood. He had written these words on it with charcoal. Here, hope grew again. Matthew gazed at the wooden sign, and tears welled up in his eyes. If this writing survives, he said, someone passing by will read it one day, and there will be light within. Beatrice was making the mushrooms and a couple of wild herbs she had picked in her basket near the hearth in the kitchen corner. This time we'll have a bit more color in our soup, she added with a smile. By the smell, it's basically a feast. Lumen circled the table. Not a feast, he said seriously. A celebration. Everyone smiled. Yes, said Beatrice. It's a celebration. By nightfall, laughter rang out amidst the walls of the monastery. It was a sort of sound that you hadn't heard for a long time. Brave, warm, live. Elias took up his flute and began to play a slow air, keeping time with the wind. Tomas struck the bell, a faint tone accompanying it. The rhythm was kept by Lumen striking a pebble. Beatrice's hands were folded. Listen, she said. This is music formed from silence. Matthew shut his eyes. Everything made sense for that moment. The silence, the losses, the prayers, the fear. They'd all seemed to have lived it out to get to that moment. Maybe, he said softly, God wants only one thing from us, to learn to rejoice once more. At the end of the evening, no one talked around the fire. Everyone was engaged in their own musings. Lumen rested her head against Matthew's shoulder. Winter is over now, isn't it? She said. Matthew ran his fingers through her hair. It's done, he said. But remember, winter has an end, but the reminiscence stays. That remembrance keeps us alive. A little wind was blowing now. The sky's clouds had thinned, and the stars were shining in silence. The monastery was full of genuine warmth for the first time since that long winter. And that night, everyone knew winter was over, and the thing that made them human was the fact that they'd been able to get through that winter together. That morning was so different air-wise. The redolence of damp ground, turned green leaves, and far-off flowers was in the air. When Matthew opened the door of the monastery, he was astonished that the breeze could be so light. This is the breath of spring now, he said with a smile. Winter's shadow has lifted, she breathed. Elias and Tomas were heating their plows, making new furrows. Lumen dashed across the room, barefoot through the muddy ground, laughing all the while as her laughter ricocheted in the concrete and glass walls. On the windows, Beatrice had draped curtains fashioned from old fabric, making the sun shine on the inside of the room. The stone chambers, once dank and dark, now shimmered with a golden tranquility. Matthew, on the other hand, was standing in the front lawn staring at the sky. The sky was not blue, but an almost translucent white. How strange, he thought. It was the same sky in those dark days. We just forgot to look at it. At noon, Elias rested the hoe in his hand and clasped his hands against the earth. Look, he said to Tomas. It's soft now. It is no longer defiant. It welcomes us, and it is telling us. Tomas let the earth press in between his fingers. The earth is a person, he said. Its wounds scar, but only if you caress it. Matthew came over to them. Today, it is not only the earth that has come to us, but we too. That afternoon, the monastery bell rang again. Not out of fear this time, but out of happiness. Beatrice's voice mingled with the bell. Our life, our vision, and then we start anew. We all sat around the fire in the evening. The skies seemed to sing a crimson song. Elias picked up his flute and played a slow melody. Tomas took a drum made up of little stones and was keeping pace. Beatrice joined hands with the children. Matthew rose, his face luminous in the fire's light. "Just the walls themselves were filled with fear once," he said. "But now we hear our voices reverberate within these walls. These walls are singing now." Lumen raised her head. "What's the title of this song?" she said. Matthew hesitated, then smiled. "To live." At once all were silent. The crackling of fire, flute sound, and the drifting wind tune accompanied each other. A winter had ended, yes. But out of that winter came more than just spring. That was what was implied in their touching, their sharing, their enduring. That night, nobody invoked inspiration to God, for everybody knew. God was already there, at that table, by that fire, in the hearts of those who eat it. And when the sky lightened in the early morning, a bird rested on the stone wall of the monastery for the first time. It flew, it blinked, and it was gone. Then the wind blew gently, as if winter were thanking them. The morning light slanted in through the monastery windows, bouncing off the stone walls like gold. From every corner came the bird song. Lumen stepped out, eyes heavy. Her bare feet felt the earth. "It's not cold anymore," she breathed. "The earth is warm." Elias, Tomas, and Beatrice came into the center and looked upon the sprouting seeds. Tiny green leaves reached for the sky, as if they wanted to make them to forget about the whole winter. Beatrice sank down to her knees and ran her hand through the soil. "We were them too," she said, "and we yielded in the dark. But one day we reached for the light again." Matthew waited by the monastery gate. A soft breeze played inside his robe, tickling his face. "These walls were quiet once," he said. "Now every stone breathes." His eyes welled up, but this time not with sorrow, instead with peace. Taking Lumen's hand, Elias joined her in ringing the bell. It was not quite like the mournful bells of early winter bells. But now through the valley rang the sound of life, not that of death. Tomas lifted his eyes and opened his hands. "Whoever hears this sound," he said, "let them be informed that humanity is reborn here." Matthew moved toward the middle of the small crowd. "Maybe one day for us too the moment will come," he added softly. "But the fire of this monastery, this land will not die. And all who come here shall learn that hope is undying." Beatrice acknowledged. "Because hope is the human spirit itself." That day, when noon had come, they all ate together. The broth was again plain, but sweet. Lumen, in the middle of the meal, plucked a flower, the first flower of spring. "It bloomed for us," he said. Matthew smiled. "No, my little friend, it blossomed for all, not just us two. For every spring is a reminder of who we are." As the day gradually gave way to the golden light of the evening, the wind was whirling around the monastery. The little wooden plaque on the door still said, "Life was reborn in space." The bell rang one final time. The glowing embers ascended into the sky, seemingly taking the last thought of winter with them. Matthew closed his eyes and drew a long breath. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching us to endure, to love, to share." Just then the wind died away, and there was silence, but it was not now appalling. This silencing was the sound of peace. One age is over, and a new age hath begun. And if it should be that the history of that little monastery was never recorded in history, but it lived on in the heart of those people, and in the glow of that fire, and in the tolling of that bell. Because every winter has a spring to give birth to. But we know how to grow again, no matter what.